It's Emily OFC Podfix. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 4. Typically, by 10:30 p.m. on a night like tonight, the crew at Station 15 would be settling into their bunks. They hadn't had a single call-out since their shift had started at 8 a.m. that morning, and the smart thing to do would be to rest up to prepare for the possibility of overnight call-outs. Tonight wasn't a typical night, though. It was New Year's Eve. And while there wasn't any alcohol present and everyone was in uniform, everything else about the party happening in the rec room was exactly what one might expect for this particular occasion. The space had been decorated enthusiastically, if a little haphazardly. Streamers hung from the ceiling, a handful of balloons had been blown up and left to tumble across the floor whenever someone crossed their path. The fire station's plastic Christmas tree was still up, looking as though this might be the last year it would be able to stand on its own under the weight of its star tree topper. The TV was even tuned to the classic New Year's Rockin' Eve in preparation for the dropping of the ball, now fewer than 2 hours away. Kakashi had spent what he considered to be an acceptable amount of time at the celebration before slipping away. While he wasn't much for social gatherings, and honestly, he was still recovering from the big department holiday to-do just a couple of weeks prior, it hadn't been half bad. The room was warm, the company was pleasant, and everyone got along better with a distraction like a major holiday. He'd even seen Iruka come out of his shell a bit, joining in on a low-stakes poker game with Genma and Guy. Having a cohesive team with a good rapport with one another was essential to performing their responsibilities as firefighters, and so it was important to Kakashi. And he did care about his crew members, all of them, even though they weren't under his command anymore. But it wasn't the same. Genma was a good engineer, well suited to the role and smart as a whip, but there was no replacing Obito. And on a night like tonight, when Obito would have been the life of the party, it was hard to enjoy the celebration without his ghost appearing in the reflection of a window or the flicker of the TV screen. And Rin. Kakashi didn't have the constitution to allow himself to even think of her at a time like this. And so when all eyes had been on Kurenai and Hana's precariously balanced Jenga tower, Kakashi had quietly slipped out. He'd wandered somewhat aimlessly before turning arbitrarily into the kitchen. He hadn't bothered turning the light on. The darkness suited his mood better, as melodramatic as that sounded. Sitting on one side of the long, 10-seater dining table, it was more than just Obito and Rin's memories that were plaguing him. In truth, he had a lot on his mind, and it seemed as though he always did nowadays. It was like the job never left him, whether he was on shift or not, and it was heavy shit to carry around 24/7. Each smoldering building was the death of someone's dream, and civilians so often choked down more thick black smoke than was survivable, whether he got to them in time or not. Kakashi knew it used to be there, the passion for this service. There had been a time when he hadn't had any doubt that he was doing what he was destined to do, what was his birthright as an occupation. But now, lately, he just didn't know. Unbidden, an image of the handsome young man he'd met on the veranda at the holiday party materialized in his mind's eye. Kakashi felt like scoffing. Where he'd found the level of energy or interest to coach the kid was beyond him, and while it seemed to have worked out all right, Kakashi resolved not to give advice to anyone else. How could he, when he was doubting his own place in the fire company? "There's no need to look so depressed about ringing in the new year." Tsunade's voice was softer than usual when it reached Kakashi's ears. He had known she was there for the way her silhouette had blocked the only light in the room filtering in from the hallway. "That is, unless you know something the rest of us don't." Tsunade entered the room without an invitation, as was her right to do as captain, but left the lights off. She crossed the room and seated herself opposite Kakashi, leaning forward in the wooden chair to perch her elbows on the table, hands folded in front of her mouth. It was a signature pose of hers, and Kakashi knew it well. It usually meant she was on the cusp of making a challenging decision. He wondered what it was this time. "What's on your mind, kid?" she asked after a few beats of silence. Kakashi stared back at her and contemplated how honest he wanted to be. With Obito and Rin gone, Tsunade was the closest thing he had left to a confidant. The light from the hallway was catching on the whites of his captain's eyes, though, and he could see that they were bloodshot. As made-up and youthful as Tsunade always looked, those who knew her well, mainly Kakashi and Shizune, could tell when she was troubled, and it was clear to Kakashi that on this New Year's Eve, Tsunade was contending with her own obstacles and didn't need the added burden of his. "It's nothing," he replied, sitting back and shaking his head, both to dismiss the question and the thoughts themselves. "What about you? Not in the party mood either?" Kakashi couldn't see her mouth where it was, hidden behind her hands, but from the crinkle of her eyes he could picture the wry smile nonetheless. "Not particularly," she admitted, turning her head to face out the station window. There was nothing to see outside, but she probably wasn't really looking. "Jiraiya is retiring from the service," she said to the window pane. Kakashi couldn't help but lift his eyebrows in surprise. Jiraiya had been a fixture of the Wilmington Fire Department for decades. Though he tried not to recall them too frequently, Kakashi had memories of his own 5-year-old self seated on a younger Jiraiya's lap at the wheel of an engine, his father on the seat beside them laughing as his son excitedly adhered a golden badge sticker to his t-shirt. To think that after all these years, Jiraiya was finally hanging up his helmet. "He says he wants to travel or something ridiculous like that. I don't know. You know him better than I do," Tsunade continued without waiting to hear Kakashi's reaction. She was right, of course. Kakashi had known Jiraiya virtually all of his life. Tsunade had only become acquainted with him as of last year's department holiday party, after which they had become quick friends despite some sort of alcohol-induced incident that Kakashi had never gotten the full details on. "They're going to post an opening for his replacement at Station 10, but in the meantime, they're putting me in charge of both stations." Kakashi suddenly understood the cause of his captain's distress. Jiraiya might be a veteran firefighter, but he wasn't known for running a tight ship by any means. Kakashi had gone to the academy with Station 10's engineer, Asuma, and between what he'd heard from him and what the attractive transferee on the veranda had shared, Kakashi imagined that the culture over at Station 10 was probably the polar opposite of what it was at Station 15. Tsunade was going to have her work cut out for her in whipping that crew into shape. He guessed that she was here to ask him to step up and help Shizune in her absence. "I can't be in 2 places at once," she said, now folding her arms across her chest and making eye contact with him again. "I'm going to appoint you acting lieutenant over Station 10, Kakashi. I want you to show them how it's done." Despite himself, Kakashi made a noise of surprise. He opened his mouth to object. "It's not a request, Hitake," she said warningly. Kakashi shook his head. "They have a lieutenant at Station 10 already," he argued. Tsunade smiled grimly. "Yes," she agreed. "Technically they do. But between you and me, he's a smart guy, but he's not a leader. I'm pulling him out to train under Shizune here. You're going there." Kakashi shook his head faster this time, leaning forward in his chair. "Shizune outranks me. If anyone should get the opportunity to—" "My mind is made up, Kakashi," Tsunade interrupted, her voice absolute, leaving no more room for argument. Kakashi sat back, silent, pensive. Tsunade let him sulk in it for a moment or two. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, voice back to the soft timbre she'd had when she first entered the room. "The quarterly lieutenant's written exam is scheduled for February. Shizune would recommend you, if you're ready to take your rank back." Kakashi frowned. It had been 3 years. When would he be rid of these conversations? "With all due respect, Captain, I'm at exactly the rank I should be." Tsunade pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes, as if trying to read something in Kakashi's own. She opened her mouth to reply, but whatever she said was drowned out entirely by the unmistakable tones of the automated voice dispatch system.
Engine 6. Structure fire. 1212 Washington Street.
Kakashi was up from his seat and nearly out the door by the time the first alert finished. He spared a glance back at Tsunade, and her expression told him that their conversation was far from over. It would have to wait, though, because the flames certainly wouldn't. Kakashi kicked the remains of a holiday wreath out of his path as he exited the wreckage of the Japanese restaurant. It had been obvious as soon as the building had come into view that there would be no saving it. The entire structure had been ablaze. With so few people out on the streets on New Year's Eve, it had probably been reported quite a bit later than it would have been on any other night. The crew had worked with speed and precision, though, and had been able to quell the fire from the exterior first and move in slowly but surely towards the ignition source, eventually stamping out the flames altogether. It had taken a keen eye at the A&C convenience store to spot the signs of arson, but anyone with even the most basic of firefighter training could have determined that this restaurant fire was no accident. There were at least 3 separate ignition sources, and clear trails were visible where the perpetrator had coaxed the fire in a zigzag pattern through the building, ensuring maximum damage. No one had been inside, thankfully. The restaurant had, in fact, been open that evening despite the holiday, but it had closed at 8 p.m., just over 2 hours before they'd received the call-out. Still, it was a shame. The restaurant had been one of Kakashi's favorite places for miso soup in the city. The street outside, which Kakashi had to imagine had been serenely quiet before the fire took hold, was now a cacophony of pushy civilians, pushier law enforcement, and his own shouting crew members as they worked to bring equipment back into the engine. It wasn't very celebratory, but at least the flashing red and white lights were festive. Kakashi was making his way toward the engine to help his crewmates, but stopped short when Shizune spotted him and began heading hurriedly in his direction. That same serious, almost panicked look she so often had present on her face. "Kakashi," she said urgently when she was within a few steps of him. "Yes, Lieutenant?" he asked, curious, but certain that it couldn't be anything good. "I have to ask you to go debrief with law enforcement," she said in a way that was nearly apologetic. "There is a Detective Morino who would like to speak with you." Shizune gestured toward the double-parked cop cars just down the road from Engine 6, and Kakashi knew immediately who Detective Morino must be. Amongst the uniformed police officers milling about stood a mountain of a man in a long black trench coat, tall and square-jawed. He was looking directly at Kakashi. Kakashi resisted the urge to sigh. He wasn't a particular fan of dealing with law enforcement. It was one of the duties he had been glad to be rid of when he'd chosen to step down from his rank as lieutenant. He wasn't entirely sure why anyone would need to speak with him in particular, but he trusted Shizune's judgment, and if she thought it was necessary, then far be it from him to object. Kakashi spared one last longing look back at his busy crew before trudging toward the detective. As he approached the man, Kakashi studied him. It was no trick of perspective. The guy was easily over 6 foot. He wore a beanie down to his brow line, but Kakashi could make out 2 large scars running diagonally across his face, one bisecting his lip. They looked long since healed, but certainly contributed to an overall extremely intimidating look. If, that is, one were the type to be intimidated. "Detective Ibiki Morino," the man offered, along with an outstretched, gloved hand. Kakashi shook it. It was a firmer grip than was strictly necessary. "Kakashi Itake," he replied. Detective Morino gave him one curt nod before immediately getting down to business, his eyes narrow and arms crossed in front of his broad chest. "Tell me what you know," he demanded. "About this arson?" Kakashi asked. "About all the arsons," the detective clarified. Kakashi frowned. "All?" he asked. "There have been 2. 4, the detective corrected. This is the 4th arson case in Wilmington in the past 3 months. Kakashi raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise. 4? Our station has only handled 2, he told the man. This one and the ANC convenience job. The detective nodded in understanding. Okay. Tell me what you know, he repeated. Kakashi took off his helmet and tucked it under his arm, running a hand through his hair in thought before responding. Both were structure fires. There was evidence of accelerant usage at both scenes. The fires were reported by... Your lieutenant told me all of this already. Detective Marino interrupted, an impatient edge in his voice. Kakashi was at a loss. Right, he said wearily. I'm not exactly sure what you need from me then, detective. The detective took in a deep breath of cold night air. It turned to steam as he breathed it out through his nose, making him look to Kakashi somewhat like a bull about to charge. I'm told you're perceptive, he said finally. Tell me what you perceived. Kakashi blinked at him, surprised. It doesn't have to be factual, the man continued. I want your hunches, your gut feelings. This was refreshing, Kakashi thought, coming from law enforcement. Typically, the cops and detectives he'd interacted with had no interest in involving the fire department in their investigations, viewing firefighters as more brawn than brain for the most part. But this Ibiki Morino was asking him for input on the investigation. Kakashi felt inclined to oblige. I think this person is taking great care to ensure no one is in the buildings they're targeting, Kakashi offered. The ANC convenience store is open almost 24/7, and this restaurant was open even on a holiday, and yet the fires were started during the small windows of time when the businesses were closed. Good, the detective nodded. Kakashi thought perhaps he might produce a notebook of some kind and jot something down, but instead he just continued to stare at him expectantly. So, Kakashi continued, thinking out loud, they aren't doing this to hurt anyone. They're doing it for some other reason. The conclusion felt lame, but without information on the alleged 2 other incidents of arson, it was the best he could come up with. What other reason? The detective asked, gaze steely. Their conversation was interrupted then by several quick booms overhead. Kakashi looked up to see the technicolor shower of fireworks in the sky above them, no doubt the culmination of a celebration at some nearby venue. It appeared the new year was upon them. Kakashi tore his eyes away from the display and shrugged. That's what you're going to find out, right? A tight-lipped but not ingenuine smile broke through Detective Morino's serious expression. I suppose I'll have to. It's Emily OFC Podfic.